August 2025. In a shopping mall somewhere in the United States, a 23-year-old employee peels a sign off the storefront glass. It reads, "Sale, everything must go." Behind her, the shelves that once overflowed with glittery earrings, headbands, and that blue chair where entire generations got their ears pierced for the first time, sit half empty. Boxes are stacked near the register. Fixtures that used to hold hundreds of earring cards are bare. A handwritten sign taped to the door lists the new, deeper discount, 60% off, then 70%, then, in the final days, whatever the manager is willing to let go for cash in hand. This is not the first time this has happened to this company. It's the second. Claire's filed for bankruptcy twice in 7 years. The first time, in 2018, the world blamed the internet, empty malls, and a generation that supposedly didn't want to shop in person anymore. The second time, in August 2025, carrying nearly $700 million in debt, the question nobody wanted to ask out loud for almost 2 decades finally had to be answered. Did the market kill Claire's, or did the people who bought it to squeeze it dry? This is the story of how a wig company became the unofficial empire of American adolescence, how Wall Street strapped a time bomb to it in 2007, and how that same bomb, diffused only halfway once, went off again 18 years later. 12 years later, in 1973, he made the move that would change everything. He bought a 25-store jewelry chain called Claire's. Instead of keeping his original company name, he adopted the name of the chain he had just acquired. Fashion Tress Industries disappeared. Claire's was born. It's worth pausing on that decision for a second, because it tells you something about how this company operated from day one. It wasn't sentimentally attached to its own name or its own original product line. It was built to expand, to acquire, to keep reinventing itself around whatever worked. That instinct is exactly what carried it through the next 3 decades of growth, and, much later, is exactly what made it such an attractive target for a very different kind of buyer. What followed was a methodical, aggressive expansion that lasted nearly 3 decades. Claire's didn't invent the concept of affordable teen accessories, but it perfected and scaled it like nobody else. It bought Topkapi in Japan in 1989 to break into Asia. It bought Bow Bangles in the UK in 1995 to lock down Europe. It bought the icing and accessory place in 1996 to dominate the premium segment inside its own home market. It bought Bijoux One in Switzerland in 1998. It bought Cleopatra in France and Afterthoughts in the United States in 1999. Every acquisition was another piece on a board Claire's was quietly winning while almost nobody realized a game was even being played. By October 2012, at the absolute peak of its history, Claire's operated 3,469 stores across 36 countries. 1,947 in North America, 1,141 in Europe, 381 franchised locations across the rest of the world. There was barely a mid-sized shopping mall in the United States, the UK, or much of Europe that didn't have a Claire's, usually near the entrance, usually surrounded by teenagers. To put that dominance in perspective, at its best, Claire's wasn't just competing against other accessory stores. It was competing, indirectly, against the entire mall for the attention of a teenage girl with $20 in her pocket. And it almost always won, because it understood something bigger brands took years to figure out. It wasn't really selling earrings. It was selling the feeling of having your own first space of choice, the one place where a preteen could pick something out without a parent deciding for her. Cat ear headbands, plastic necklaces in every color, glittery backpacks, cheap makeup made for practicing before it was for real. Store by store, Claire's built the physical stage for an entire stage of millions of people's lives. But the real secret weapon, the reason so many people carry an emotional relationship with this brand that goes far beyond buying a pair of earrings, was a service most of its competitors never dared to copy at the same scale: ear piercing. Claire's ended up piercing more ears than any other retailer on the planet. Over 80 million piercings across more than 25 years. The company would pierce babies as young as 3 months old. It had its own internal rules, like refusing to do cartilage piercings on anyone under 13. For millions of people, especially women, the first conscious memory of becoming a person with earrings happened in that blue chair, with a piercing gun, inside a Claire's store. It isn't an exaggeration to say Claire's built, almost by accident, a genuine cultural rite of passage. No spreadsheet captures that, and that's exactly what makes this story hurt more than any other retail collapse driven by the same underlying economics. That ritual, repeated roughly 80 million times over 25 years, is what turned Claire's into something bigger than a successful retail chain. It turned it into cultural infrastructure. And like most cultural infrastructure that quietly works, almost nobody stopped to ask how solid the financial foundation underneath that blue chair actually was. And this is where the story stops being about wigs, earrings, and shopping malls, and becomes a story about debt. In 2007, at the absolute peak of the American private equity boom, the same year, worth remembering, that the seeds of the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression were already being planted, Apollo Global Management, one of the most aggressive private equity firms in the country, bought Claire's in a leveraged buyout worth $3.1 billion. For anyone unfamiliar with how a leveraged buyout works, Apollo didn't pay that $3.1 billion out of its own pocket. It covered a fraction with its own capital, and financed the rest with debt that wasn't put on Apollo's books. It was put on Claire's books. The company Apollo had just bought became the one responsible for paying off the debt used to buy it. It's essentially buying a house and making the house itself sign the mortgage. To be clear about how unusual this is compared to a normal business purchase, if you bought a small local shop with a loan, you would be the one personally responsible for paying it back, out of your own income, from other sources if the shop struggled. In a leveraged buyout, the buyer routes that responsibility straight through the company being bought. Apollo kept the upside if Claire's did well. Claire's, not Apollo, carried nearly all of the downside risk if it didn't. This structure isn't illegal, and it isn't even unusual in private equity, it's the standard playbook. But it does mean that from day one of the acquisition, Apollo's financial interests and Claire's operational survival were not automatically the same thing. This is not a minor technical detail. It is the origin of literally everything that came after. A company that until that point had generated cash consistently, that had grown without interruption for more than 3 decades, suddenly had to start funneling an enormous share of its profits, year after year, simply toward interest payments on a debt it never chose to take on. That money didn't go toward opening smart new stores. It didn't go toward building a competitive online store before Amazon finished eating physical retail alive. It didn't go toward modernizing the brand for the next generation of teenagers. It went to interest, and this wasn't some one-off accident, something that just happened to Claire's out of bad luck. It's a pattern repeated dozens of times across American retail over the last 2 decades. A private equity firm buys a profitable chain using debt that gets loaded onto the chain itself, extracts fees and dividends during the good years, and 18, 20, 25 years later, when the business can no longer carry the weight, blames e-commerce or changing consumer habits. Toys R Us, Payless, Sears, all of them share fragments of the exact same structure. Claire's wasn't the exception to the rule of modern retail. It was, almost word for word, the instruction manual. For several years, Claire's held on. The day-to-day business stayed profitable. But debt pressure works like a slow leak. You don't notice it until the ship is already half sunk. By 2018, Claire's was carrying $2.1 billion in debt. Online commerce was no longer a future threat, it was the present reality. Mall foot traffic kept falling year after year. And Claire's, hands tied by a financial structure Apollo had imposed on it 11 years earlier, simply didn't have the financial muscle to respond. On March 19, 2018, Claire's filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It emerged from that bankruptcy in October of the same year, after eliminating $1.9 billion of its debt. On paper, it sounded like a redemption story. Elliott Management and Monarch Alternative Capital, 2 investment firms specializing in distressed debt, took control of the company and injected $575 million in fresh financing to stabilize operations. Claire's survived. Headlines at the time called it a second chance. But here's the detail almost nobody reported at the time, and one that is impossible to ignore now, looking back. During that first bankruptcy process, not everyone stayed quiet about what had actually happened. Oaktree Capital Management, an investment firm holding senior secured notes issued by Claire's, filed formal objections in court during the restructuring process. Oaktree's attorneys alleged that Apollo Global Management had exercised what they called unfettered control over the company's decisions for more than a decade, and publicly questioned, in court filings, how independent Claire's decision-making really was from the interests of its controlling equity sponsor. Oaktree described certain terms of the restructuring plan as onerous, and warned the arrangement would strip roughly $240 million of second lien debt of virtually all value, while Apollo, by Oaktree's own account, ended up aligned with the plan's beneficiaries. In other words, back in 2018, inside an active bankruptcy court, there was a formal, documented warning that Claire's underlying problem wasn't Amazon or empty shopping malls. It was that the same control structure that had loaded the company with $3.1 billion of debt in 2007 was still fully intact. Nobody dismantled it, nobody fixed it at the root. The symptom got refinanced, the disease stayed exactly where it was. Over the following 6 years, under the new ownership of Elliott and Monarch, Claire's operated in a kind of holding pattern. It didn't collapse, it also didn't transform. The brand stayed relevant to a certain audience, but the world around it was changing faster than the company could keep up. Think about everything that changed in retail between 2018 and 2025. TikTok went from barely existing at scale in the West to becoming the single most powerful trend discovery engine on the planet, and with it came dozens of jewelry and accessory brands born directly on social media, without the weight of thousands of physical stores or debt inherited from a leveraged buyout. Online shopping for teenagers stopped being a secondary option and became the primary channel. And through all of it, Claire's kept funneling a significant share of its cash flow into servicing a debt structure that, while smaller than in 2007, was still there, still weighing the company down, still limiting how much it could invest in catching up. It isn't that nobody at Claire's saw these shifts coming. It's that seeing a shift coming and actually having the capital available to respond to it are two completely different things when a large chunk of your cash already has somewhere else to go before the year even starts. And then came 2025. On August 6, 2025, Claire's Holdings filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy again, this time before the United States Bankruptcy Court for the District of Delaware. Second bankruptcy in 7 years. This time, funded debt stood at $690 million. The reasons the company's own leadership cited in the legal filings paint a brutal picture of what it means to fall behind in modern retail. Constant, aggressive discounting that eroded margins for years, serious inventory mismatches, supply chain disruptions, and an additional blow nobody expected at this scale. A projected $30 million tariff hit on products imported from China, landing at the exact moment the company could least absorb it. But behind the numbers is a simpler, more painful story. Claire's stopped being the place the youngest generation actually wanted to go. Gen Z and Gen Alpha, today's teenagers and preteens, simply shop differently. They shop online, and when they buy jewelry, many of them no longer want the bright, glittery style that defined Claire's for decades. They want something more sophisticated, more minimalist. Worse still for Claire's, its flagship product, ear piercing, the business that had made it nearly untouchable for 25 years, started losing ground to new, specialized competitors like Rowan & Studs, brands built from scratch for a generation that wants a more premium, more visibly hygienic, more aesthetically current piercing experience. That last point deserves a moment, because it might be the most symbolic blow in this entire story. For 25 years, if you wanted your ears pierced at an American mall, you basically had no alternative to Claire's. It was, in practice, a cultural monopoly. But a monopoly built on habit and nostalgia isn't protected from anything once a newer, cleaner-looking, better-positioned on social media competitor shows up, one without 30 years of mall store infrastructure weighing down its cost structure. Rowan & Studs didn't have to carry debt inherited from a 2007 leveraged buyout. They started from zero, at the exact moment Claire's could least afford to reinvent itself from zero too. On top of all this came the tariff shock. $30 million projected in additional cost on goods imported from China. The kind of external shock a healthy company can absorb without much drama, but one a company already funneling hundreds of millions of dollars a year just to service its debt simply cannot. At the time of filing, Claire's was still running an enormous network, roughly 2,300 company-operated stores, 230 franchise locations, 9,000 concession spaces inside other retailers, and 210 shop-in-shops inside Walmart. The company announced the immediate closure of 700 stores. Of the 1,350 stores it had in the United States, 700 were deemed simply unsustainable. It's worth explaining what that phrase, going concern, actually means, because it's the hinge this entire second bankruptcy turned on. When a company files Chapter 11, there are, broadly, two different roads it can take. One is reorganization. The company keeps operating, sheds part of its debt, and comes out the other side smaller but alive, the way Claire's itself did back in 2018. The other is liquidation. The company's assets, inventory, leases, the brand name itself, get sold off piece by piece, or as a whole, to the highest bidder, and the original corporate entity effectively ceases to exist in its old form. In 2025, Claire's was fighting for the first outcome and bracing for the second. The company pursued what's called a dual-track process, negotiating a possible sale to a buyer who would keep stores open, while simultaneously preparing a liquidation plan in case no such buyer appeared. Store closures rolled out in waves as that process unfolded, an initial list of stores, then a larger list, then an even larger one, each round reflecting how the sale negotiations were going in real time. More than 150 potential buyers were contacted in a search for a rescue that would keep the company alive as a going concern. Not one emerged willing to take on the full risk. In the end, the sale went to AWS Claire's, an affiliate of the firm Ames Watson, for $140 million, $104 million in cash and $36 million in the form of a seller note. Take a second to sit with that number. Apollo paid $3.1 billion for this company in 2007. 18 years later, after 2 bankruptcies, the entire company sold for $140 million. Less than 5% of what it cost to buy it in the first place. The sale formally closed on September 18, 2025. The liquidation plan was confirmed on October 29. It went into effect on November 10, 2025. Under Ames Watson's new ownership, an estimated 800 to 950 stores are expected to keep operating across North America, in a leaner footprint, trying to rebuild from a fraction of what the company once was. 64 years after Roland Schaefer started out selling wigs, and 18 years after Apollo Global Management decided Claire's could carry $3.1 billion of debt without consequence, the brand that pierced more than 80 million ears around the world survives, but no longer as the empire that once ruled shopping malls across the planet. It survives as a fraction of itself, run by its third set of owners in less than 2 decades. What makes Claire's story different from so many other chains that collapsed in recent years isn't the cause of the collapse. Tariffs, e-commerce, generational change, that happened to dozens of brands. What makes Claire's different is that back in 2018, in a public court filing, someone had already pointed to exactly where the bomb was buried. Nobody defused it, the explosion was simply postponed for 7 years. And there's one more thing worth saying before this story closes, because it's easy to narrate a corporate collapse as if it were only a chain of numbers: debt, EBITDA, valuation, liquidation. But behind the 700 stores that closed in 2025 were employees who had worked 10, 15, 20 years in the same mall location, watching entire generations of customers walk in holding a parent's hand to get their ears pierced for the first time, and years later come back with daughters of their own to do exactly the same thing. That kind of continuity, that shared memory built store by store over decades, never shows up on a balance sheet. But it may be the most expensive thing lost in this entire process. Claire's still exists. Under Ames Watson, with fewer stores and a far lighter debt structure, the brand has, for the first time in 18 years, a real chance to operate without a time bomb sitting on its balance sheet. It is, quite literally, the first moment since 2007 that Claire's owes nothing to the logic of a leveraged buyout. Whether that's enough for it to survive another generation remains to be seen. What we do know, with the clarity that only hindsight provides, is this: Claire's story isn't the story of a brand that simply stopped being relevant to teenagers. It's the story of a brand that was never allowed to invest in staying relevant, because every dollar it made already had an owner before it ever reached the register. The question this story leaves behind isn't whether Claire's could have avoided its 2025 collapse. The question is how many other brands you still know, still walk past this very week, are carrying the exact same bomb right now, planted years ago by someone who, by the time it finally goes off, will already be long gone. Claire's is not an isolated case, and it won't be the last one built on this exact same blueprint. Somewhere right now, a private equity firm is closing a leveraged buyout on a chain you recognize, financed the same way, carrying the same structural risk, counting on nobody connecting the dots for another 15 or 20 years. When that story finally breaks, it will be reported, just like this one was, as a story about changing consumer habits, about a brand that lost touch with its customers. And somewhere in a court filing nobody reads, there will probably already be a warning saying exactly what actually happened. If this brand loaded more debt onto itself than most countries carry in national budgets and still got sold for pocket change, you have to wonder how many other stores on your block are quietly running the same playbook. If you want to see which one we're tracking next, there's a video on this channel breaking down exactly that. Go watch it after this one. And if you've made it this far, hit subscribe to Sunset Clause, because we post a new collapse story like this one every week. Drop a comment below. What company do you think is next on this list? I read every single one.